Then we're going to go on to what medieval Islamic governance looks like. Then we're going to talk about Islam. Do you want to?
Well, preempted your intro, but it's okay.
All right, go ahead.
Welcome to the American Sephardi Federation. We're very honored to have you. This is the inaugural lecture of our new Sephardi Scholar Space. And I want to tell you a little bit about ASF and a little bit about this space in this lecture. So the American Sephardi Federation preserves and promotes the rich, greater Sephardic heritage throughout the world. And our role here at the center is to collect the physical artifacts, the books, the documents, the Judaica, and also the stories. So we digitally document with our partners, Diarna, the physical structures that remain in the Middle East and North Africa, and also the oral histories. ASF also has publications, the Sephardi World Weekly, the Sephardi Ideas Monthly, and the Sephardi Report magazine. All of you will be receiving a complimentary copy of the Sephardi Report before you leave. We also do major events here at the center, including, please keep your calendars available for the 20th New York Sephardic Jewish Film Festival from March 30th to April 6th. The idea for this lecture and the idea for this space the credit is due to a member of our board, Joseph Greenberger. He's right there. I'd like everyone to recognize him. Joseph was speaking to me and he said that wouldn't it be wonderful to have a space at the center where scholars could visit, could talk, could leave their stuff while they're in from Israel, from France, from elsewhere. And I said, do you mind if I take that idea and make one tweak to it, which is to add the word Sephardi? And he said, sure. And then, fortuitously, I was meeting with our board president, David Dangor, who is the honorary Swedish Consul General in New York. And the Swedish Consul was moving. And they said, would you like our furniture? And they ended up giving us all of this beautiful furniture. And we had the Sukkot to build this Sephardi Scholar Center during Sukkot. It was a very tight timeline, but we were able to get it done. And then, later on, we were at a lecture, Joseph and I, on Islam and the Jews. And the presenter was very well credentialed, but not as impressive as Richard. And causing some consternation among people in the audience who were yelling out things like, what about the assassins? And I said to Joseph, watch what happens if Richard gets to ask a question. And I was waiting for it, I was hoping, and then he got to ask the question, and the professor's only response to that question was, I think you're looking for the graduate seminar. This is the seminar for the public. So it was that idea that was born that night to invite Richard to give a lecture here, to inaugurate our Sephardi Scholar Center. And he's one of a breed of young Sephardi scholars who have tremendous skills, are not necessarily pursuing doctoral studies or in the academy, but could if they wanted to. And Richard's resume is most impressive. Fordham Law School, Fordham undergrad. He studied at the Saudi-funded Center for Muslim and Christian Dialogue at Georgetown, has studied in Morocco, and has mastered Arabic and mastered this topic on Islamism. So we're very, very happy to have Richard here tonight. And we had 1,000 people RSVP for this event, but we decided to only pick the best people to be here. We did have, and I think just learned maybe some diplomats are water soluble, but we had some diplomats who had RSVP'd this event. Hopefully they'll still come. We have some other board members who will be joining us, but I'd like to get started with Richard now. Thank you.
A bit on that introduction. Diarna is actually a really great institute. I don't know if they're going to have any lectures coming up soon, but when they do, you should see it. They take Google Earth and they'll zoom into a particular Jewish site that used to, or still does exist, depends on the site. And in the Arab world, these places are effectively inaccessible to Jews today. And so it really helps to preserve the memory of what we've lost, partially due to Islamism. And so, as I was saying before, this presentation sort of breaks into two pieces. We're going to talk first about what Islamism is, where does it come from, And then the second piece is, what does Islamism have to say about Jews? And what has Islamism done about Jews? Okay. So, right, medieval Islamic governance, development of Islamism as a concept, Islamist perceptions of Jews, shared Islamism and Jews, expansion of Islamism into the West, and of course implications for Jews, and jihadist states. And then if there's any questions left over, we'll address those. So we've got our vocabulary, right? So I like to put it in a rubric here because it's a little easier to suss out the terms. And one of the things that often happens when you have a dialogue about Islam is that the terms become a jumbled mess and people will use them interchangeably when they're actually very specific in terms of meaning and application. So we're going to have, on the left-hand side, we're going to talk about what the concept generally falls into. Then we're going to talk about what the term is for the concept, and then the term for somebody who opposes that concept or that group of people. So the first concept is the religion, right? Religion is, what do you believe about God? What kind of rituals do you do? How does the supernatural affect your life, right? And so, as concerns Islam, the religion is called Islam, and somebody who doesn't like Islam, who believes, for example, that it's immoral, or that certain actions of Muhammad were immoral, or disagrees with certain particular teachings of the religion, is an anti-Islamicist. The next level is the people, right? So, if you are a person who believes in Islam, you are a Muslim. And if you hate people who are themselves Muslims, you are an anti-Muslim bigot, or in the older text was the term anti-Mohammedan. That term has fallen out of style since we no longer call Muslims Mohammedans. Finally, we have the concept of political ideologies, right? And political ideology is, how do I want my government run? And so, if you want your government run according to Islamic law, you're going to call that an Islamist or jihadist government. And if I oppose that, I don't want Islam to run my government. I want some other system, be it secularism, be it irreligion, some other kind of political ideology, then I'm an anti-Islamist. Notice that the wording is a little bit confusing, because anti-Islamist refers to the political ideology, anti-Islamicist refers to the religion. And just to clarify this one more time, right? Islamism is not Islam, Islam is not Muslim. We have to keep these terms separate. And again, Muslim is the person who follows the religion of Islam. And this is also a key point. Many Muslims are simply born Muslims. They're born into Muslim families, the same way that Jews are born into Jewish families. They might not practice, they might not believe, or they might believe very, very limited amounts of the faith, and they'll still call themselves Muslims. So we're talking about humans here. We're not talking about specifically what they believe. Islam is specifically what they believe, but in terms of God and their rituals and their behaviors between one another. And Islamism, right, is the specific implementation of Islamic law as the national law of a modern country. This is the simplest definition of Islamism that can be put down. It is a theocratic institution in a modern nation state. And jihadism is Islamism, but the way that you achieve this government is through war, through sacred violence. Now, an Islamist could, for example, achieve the transition to Islamic government through democratic means. They could pass bills. They could run political parties. They could find other means. They could convince the people that are in power to start enacting different types of laws. All those people are Islamists, but they're not jihadists. Jihadists, while they want that end result of a theocratic nation state, they're going to do it through war. And they believe that this war is holy. And then I wanted to get into this idea of extremism and radicalism. These terms are sort of bandied about. I personally find these terms very useless because they don't actually describe anything. When you say something is extreme, do you mean that the people are violent, that they're ultra-religious, that they're abnormal, that they're politically active? These terms, extremism and radicalism, don't help us because they have no coherent definition and could change from person to person. And if I say that, for example, we're talking about people who are just very religious, you have very religious people who just don't want to do anything with politics. Their religion is something that they do personally, it's private, and their politics could be secularist or it could be irreligious. the definition of Islamism is somebody who wants to legislate Islam as the law of a country, right? If I want to legislate, I'm an Islamist. If I don't want to legislate, I'm not an Islamist. And so it's a very clear definition. And one of the key things that we can take away here is that there are conservative Muslims, even very religious Muslims, who are not Islamists. And conversely, you can have people that look completely, quote, normal to Western eyes, and these people are very clearly Islamists. This is one of the things that I think really drives this point home. On the left we have Sayyid Ayad Jamaluddin, and on the right we have Abdul Naim Abdul Futuh, and these are two politicians from the Arab world. Sayyid Ayad Jamaluddin is from Iraq, and Abdul Naim Abdul Futuh is from Egypt. Now, we can talk about their pedigree. Sayyid is actually a cleric. He studied at Qom, which is he's Shiite, and Qom is the holiest city in Shiite Islam after Mecca and Medina. And he studied there for 8 years. After that, he went to Dubai and founded a Shiite evangelist center. He's a very religious person. You can see there he's dressed in the typical Shiite clerical robes. And conversely, we have Abdul Monim Abu Futuh. He graduated from the University of Cairo with degrees in both medicine and law. He famously debated Anwar Sadat on the question of freedom of speech. And so you're thinking to yourself, wow, this guy on the left, he's clearly the Islamist, and the guy on the right is going to be a secularist, and nothing could be further from the truth. Sayyid Ayad Jamaluddin is an ardent secularist. He believes that Islam, when it's incorporated into a state structure, will worsen Islam. It will give it the particularity and the sins, if you want to call them that, of political actions of the state. And conversely, that the state will be maladaptive for Islam, in that Islam is supposed to be about personal relationships, and the state can corrupt that. Conversely, Abdul Monem al-Futuh was, until Morsi joined the Egyptian election in 2012, the leading Islamist candidate. And we have here Yusuf al-Qaradawi, who's probably the most important individual in Sunni Islam, probably the closest thing to a Sunni pope that exists. He's not a Sunni pope, but closest that exists. And you see here, he's supporting Futuh for the presidency of Egypt because of his Islamist credentials. So this is another thing that this is going to take just a few seconds, but whenever there's a conversation about Islam, somehow the end of the sentence becomes, all Muslims do X. Even though the word all never appeared in the previous sentence, never had a place in the previous sentence, and is clearly not intended by the speaker. So if I don't say a specific word, assume majority. I'm talking about 50 to 67%. But if I use a different word, if I use minority, significant minority, overwhelming majority, almost all, that can give you sort of an idea about the percentages that I'm talking about, the sort of ranges of people who may ascribe to a certain idea. Now, Islamism today is a significant minority in the Islamic world. It's not the majority, but the thing is, a significant minority who has political clout and who wants to actually make changes in society can often achieve them. And one of the things that they're very interested in is Jews, which is really strange, because when Islamists came to power, primarily in the 1970s, there weren't Jews in the Arab world anymore. There weren't Jews in the Muslim world by and large. The only places where they really existed were Turkey and Iran. So why are they so concerned about Jews? That's what the rest of this presentation is really going to talk about. And in order to really understand this, we have to sort of understand where Islamists come from and what their relationship to Jews has been historically. So we're going to need to go back to the medieval period. And so we're going to look at the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire will serve as a template for what medieval systems look like. In the Ottoman state was a theocratic state, but you had two leaders. You had the Sultan and you had the Shaykh al-Islam. And the Sultan had terrestrial powers, and the Shaykh al-Islam had religious powers. We're going to flesh this out a little bit more. Now, the particular Sultan and Shaykh al-Islam that I have here, Suleiman the Magnificent and Abu Saud Effendi, were two individuals that are very famous in the history of the Ottoman Empire, but I could have chosen any sultan and any Sheikh al-Islam, and this situation would have been the same pretty much until the late 1800s, for reasons that we're going to discuss in about a few minutes. So, when we talk about the difference in terms of religiosity, right, the sultan is going to apply terrestrial law. He's going to be worried about contracts. He's going to be worried about defending the country. He's going to be worried about managing general courts of business and trade. Whereas the Sheikh al-Islam will be worried about Islamic law. He'll be worried about marriages, right, between two Muslims. He'll be worried about whether or not the charity at the mosques is being paid. These are things that keep their branches of power separate. The second thing is when it comes to taxation, right? The sultan is going to deal with taxes and the jizya. The jizya is a poll tax that's applied to non-Muslims, Jews and Christians, and makes sure that they remember that they are inferior legally to the Muslims. Then you have the Sheikh al-Islam who will enforce zakat. Zakat is the Muslim required contribution of charity. So you can see the taxes belong to our terrestrial issue, so it belongs to the sultan. The zakat is an Islamic issue, so it belongs to the Sheikh al-Islam. And similarly, when it comes to the military, right? The sultan will actually deploy the armies. He'll say, General, attack this country, invade this land, come back, defend the homeland. But, of course, he's simply a ruler. He has no religious clout. And so what the Sheikh al-Islam will do, will say, this is a proper action in accordance with Islamic mandate that we attack this country. Let's say that it was wars against the Austrian Empire. They would say this is a Christian country. Muslims have the right to prevail over Christians, and they'll issue the fatwa to give moral support and legitimacy to the conquests. And finally, education. At this point, the people who were primarily educated would be Muslims, but non-Muslims were educated by non-Muslim representatives, millet leaders. But when it came down to education for Muslims, right, the Sultan will take care of bureaucrats. How are people going to run the state? And the Sheikh al-Islam will take care of Islamic legal education. So we're talking about who's going to be the next cleric, who's going to be the next mufti, and create a system of Islamic jurisprudence. And since he's running the show that will eventually be the next successors, the next Sheikh al-Islam will come from these kinds of schools, it creates a very stultified method of teaching and education and preserves the tradition very well. So there are a few takeaways that I want sort of us to leave with about medieval political Islam from this discussion. The first thing is that it's pretty much consistent through the caliphates. There are some times where these two people will be blended into one person. There are some times when you'll have a general who takes power. Al-Mansur, for example, in Spain is a perfect example of this. He usurps the power of the caliph during his reign in the 900s. But generally speaking, you will have a sultan or a caliph or somebody who has terrestrial authority, and you'll have a Sheikh al-Islam who will have religious authority. And so this system will exist pretty much from the 600s to the late 1800s. And you're going to have a separation of duties that follows this exact line, where the terrestrial ruler will not touch the religious issues issue will not touch the terrestrial issues, but there will be a lot of conversation between the two parties. And of course, this is very clearly a theocracy. The Shaykh al-Islam has political power. He makes laws about marriage, about inheritance. He decides disputes in religious courts. This is clearly a theocracy, but it operates differently than it exists today. Ironically, Saudi Arabia is the only country that really continues this medieval system, where you have the Wahhabi clerics, and the Wahhabi clerics have an incredible amount of pull on religious matters, but the king of Saudi Arabia is himself not a cleric. The king of Saudi Arabia is a devout lay person. And so you have this sort of balance of powers where the Saudi king will issue laws about taxation and governance and these sorts of issues, and the Wahhabi clerics will advise the president, advise the king on matters of an Islamic nature, and their advice pretty much becomes law. So, one of the things that will happen when the modern world comes in is that this system will break down. And you'll have Kemalism and colonialism. Kemalism is the modernization movement in Turkey. Colonialism is the European powers invading the rest of the Islamic world. And so you're going to end Islamic legal supremacism. If we remember back, right, you have the Sheikh al-Islam and you have the Sultan, who are both Muslim leaders, and they refuse to allow the other peoples, the non-Muslims, the Jews and the Christians, to have political authority. They'll be organized in millets, but these are subordinate. And when the modern era comes, this system of inequality is going to suffer severe setbacks, i.e. there will be more equality. This is a particularly difficult image for a lot of Muslims. This was when the Caliph of the Ottoman Empire, the last Caliph until this most recent Caliph was appointed in 2014 in Islamic State. This was the last Caliph, and you can see here he's Abdul Majid II. He's just gotten off of his chair, and you have the Turkish military officials there to escort him out of the building. He has been removed from power. And this was a hugely devastating event in the history of Islam. I think the closest way to imagine it is imagine if the Italian soldiers had walked into the St. Peter's Basilica and marched the Pope out at knife point and said, this is the end of Catholicism. Then, the second thing is that a lot of the Ottoman Empire, because it was a medieval system, was decentralized. So you'd have judges in local jurisdictions who would be working out the Islamic law under the guidance of the Sheikh al-Islam through the different colleges that he had set up, right? Because he was responsible for Islamic education, so you had people who were Islamically educated in the different provinces. And these people were called qadis, or judges. And with the rise of the modern nation state and further integration, the qadis became significantly weaker in their ability to administer justice. And you also began to see Western-style education. This system of bifurcated education where you'd have secular, quote-unquote, education run by the Sultan and religious education run by the Sheikh al-Islam, this was beginning to erode, and you were beginning to have singular schools that would teach you all the information you needed to be a successful bureaucrat, and perhaps there would be some religion as well. But depending on the secularity of the Western-style country doing the occupying, like, let's say, France, the religion would be more and more ostracized. Finally, and this is most important for us, you'll have the integration of minorities into society. During the late 1800s, before the British and the French actually come to the Middle East, in terms of their armies, they sent missionaries and they sent people who wanted to reach out to the minorities there. And this happened on both the Jewish side and on the Christian side. They built schools. Probably the most famous Jewish school is Alliance Israélite, which was a number of Jews in France who came to the Middle East, and they built schools primarily in Iraq and in Lebanon. And this allowed the Jews and the Christians to become more educated and more able to become involved in the governance structure. In the Jewish case, it led to Jews primarily becoming bureaucrats. In the Christian case, it led to them primarily joining the armies when the colonizers did come. A perfect example was that in the 1940s, in Iraq, there were what were called the Iraq levies, which were indigenous Iraqis who served in the British Armed Forces in Iraqi-only units. 70% of those units were Christian. Even though Christians make up less than 5% of Iraq's population, it just shows how integrated they were because of this Western-style education. So the Arabs especially, because the thought process of modernity in the Islamic world is really going to come out of the Arab world. So the Arabs sort of have four general responses to this complete change, 180 degrees from the previous system that they knew. Right? Their first choice were the liberals. And the liberals really loved Western society. They believed in human rights, ethics, and they want to include minorities. They want to create modern nation states. And we will never hear about these people ever again because they will not ever win political power. They still exist, and They're fun to listen to from time to time, but they're really going to exit our story. You have the nationalists. The nationalists believe in local ethnic nationalism. It's very similar to the right-wing parties of Europe today, where they believe that there's something special about insert ethnicity, be it Turkishness or Persianness. They're generally secular in terms of their leaning. They're not terribly interested in Islamic governance, but what they really care about is the historic identity of that nation. What makes a person a Turk? What makes a person a Persian? And they are incredibly hostile to local minorities and colonists, which means that, generally speaking, Jews will not find good camp with the nationalists unless the nationalists don't see the Jews as a threat. You have the Arab socialists. Now, the Arab socialists have something similar to the nationalists in that they believe that the ethnicity counts, but they don't believe in a localized ethnicity. They believe in a transnational Arab ethnicity. Their goal is to create a unified Arab state. Now, they're also secular, but what they really care about is creating an Arab Islamic culture. So when religion is necessary to create that, they're willing to bend the rules a little bit. And they respect non-Muslims, as long as those non-Muslims come out as Arabs. This is why a number of Arab socialists are Arab Christians. As long as they put the Arab in front of their name, they can be part of the group. Jews generally did not do this. Jews refused to Arabize. They refused to consider themselves Arabs. And so the Arab socialists were hostile to the non-Arab minorities, like the Jews. And finally, the group that we're actually going to be following are the Islamists. Now, notice how there's a clear divide here, right? Because all these guys are secular. The liberals are secular, the nationalists are secular, the Arab socialists are generally secular, the Islamists are not. They want Islamic law to be the law of the land. And similar to the Arab socialists, they believe in a transnational identity. But their transnational identity is the Muslim identity. One of the things to notice here is that they're using Muslim as if it were an ethnicity, right? Because you can't have an identity simply based on what you believe. You have an identity based on what you are. And so it transitions Muslim into an ethnicity. And we're going to see some of the people who talk about this a little bit later. Actually, if you can pass out those sheets, that'll be helpful later. And the most important thing is, the liberals, nationalists, and Arab socialists believe in some kind of legitimacy by voting. The Islamists don't. Islamists believe that Islam should be the governing authority regardless of whether people want it or not. Islam is right. Why would you question it? So, okay, right? Going back to the definition. Islamic law is the law of a modern country. Just wanted to have that up there. So we're going to talk about three people. The first one is Sayyid Qutb. Sayyid Qutb really creates Islamism as an idea. And he's going to, the quotes, which are what are on that sheet that's being passed around, we're going to sort of look at what he has to say about Islamism and why it's important. The second person we're going to look at is Hassan al-Banna, who was the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood. Both of those two men are Egyptians. And we're going to look at Abu al-Maududi, who is a Pakistani. Actually, he was born in India, but he's generally seen as Pakistani because he was Muslim and he did not believe in a unified India. And he was a scholar of the Quran, and he wanted to connect Islamism as the political ideology to Islam as the religion, and show that there really was no difference between Islam and Islamism. And this is something that we're going to see. That this separation that I put at the very beginning of the slide is something that Islamists don't want to argue, because it's much easier for them to say, if this is your religion, then you have to follow it, than for them to say that this is a political ideology that you have to ascribe to in addition to a religion. So here's Sayyid Qutb. He's a seminal Islamist. And can we turn on the lights a little bit? Okay. Does anybody want to read the first quote?
Sure.
Okay.
I'll read it. Some of them call this freedom from hypocrisy and facing the truth, but there is a fundamental difference between freedom from hypocrisy and freedom from the components of humanity that separate man from animals. Humanity, as its long history, was not unaware that sexual desires are normal and true, but it consciously or unconsciously struggled to control them, escaping its slavery and distancing themselves from its primitive levels. Yes, it is a need, so why does humanity shy away from realizing its need? Because it feels inherently that controlling such desires is testament to freedom from slavery and to going beyond the first rungs of humanity's evolution, and that a return to the freedom of the jungle is a gripping slavery and a relapse to the first primitive levels.
Perfect. So, what do you think that he's trying to say here? Anybody can answer. Basically, this is actually a very funny story. Kutub was an exchange student in Colorado in the year 1951, and he went to a church, and he expected to find a very religious institution, and he found boys and girls dancing in the cellar of the church, and he was bothered immensely by the closeness, physical closeness, between the boys and the girls on the dance floor. So his entire view was that Western society was turning people who ordinarily were moral agents into decadent fools who had no respect for the development of civilization and were just sexual beings given to their urges. And so he was really worried that this kind of Western culture would infect the Islamic world. If the Islamic world is taking on these sort of Western influences, they're going to become ignorant of God and enter a state of jahiliyyah, or ignorance. No, keep the lights on. The next thing is, we're going to see in the next quote, which is that he basically believed, that Islam would deteriorate without Islamic law being imposed from above, and so he really supported the use of violence, and I think the next quote illustrates that. Warfare in Islam is something for which Islam deserves to be praised, not condemned. The defeatist should fear Allah, lest they distort his religion and cause it to become weak on the basis of the claim that it is a religion of peace. Yes, it is the religion of peace, but in the sense of saving all of mankind from worshipping anything other than Allah, and submitting all of mankind to the rule of Allah. Notice that it's both worship and governance. This is the religion of Allah, not the ideas of any person or the product of human thought, so those who promote it should feel ashamed to state its ultimate goal, which is that all religion should be for Allah alone. And when there is a divine system in law, and alongside it there are human systems and laws, then the divine law has the right to remove the barriers and free people from enslavement to human beings. This is a manifesto for invading countries, for overthrowing governments, in order to impose Islamic law, which shows that he is on the jihadist bent, right, of Islamism. He believes that violence will solve the problem. And finally, he saw politics as part of religion, and the last quote sort of deals with that, his idea of a worldwide system where Islam is the politics, that there's no divide between Islam and Islamism. You have Hassan al-Banna, and he's also a seminal Islamist. His major argument is that there's a common religious identity. We were talking about this a little bit before, that the Islamists see Muslim as an ethnicity, as well as a religious group. And Hassan al-Banna really makes this clear in the quote that I have here. The Muslim Brotherhood consider this unity as holy and believe in this union, striving for the joint action of all Muslims and the strengthening of the Brotherhood of Islam. And then finally, an association of Muslims should be set up, which would elect the Imam in the capital, right? So he's imagining an Islamic government over all Muslims, where Muslims are themselves governing themselves according to Islamic means. But he saves his comments on the way they should govern, and spends most of his time actually talking about the fact that Muslims are simply an ethnic group. Now, as I said, he founded the Muslim Brotherhood, and of course one of its major goals was that it would be modeled on European fascism, because this was an effective way to gain power. And of course he was anti-Zionist and pro-Palestinian. Hassan al-Banna was active primarily in the late 1930s and early 1940s. He was responsible for agitating a number of anti-Jewish riots in Egypt, and he himself, along with several of his compatriots in the Brotherhood, fought Israel in the War of Independence. He was assassinated shortly after that. And then our last Islamist is Abu al-Maududi, and he lived in India, so we have a very different scenery here, but similarly, he valued the divine laws, the article of governance, and he supported the use of violence. In the quote that I have here from him, he basically said, Islam is a revolutionary faith that comes to destroy any government made by man. Islam doesn't look for a nation to be in a better condition than another nation. Islam doesn't care about the land or who owns the land. The goal of Islam is to rule the entire world and submit all of mankind to the faith of Islam. Any nation or power in this world that tries to get in the way of that goal, Islam will fight and destroy. In order to fulfill that goal, Islam can use every power available, every way it can, to be used to bring worldwide revolution. This is jihad. That last line, this is jihad, pulls all of this political rhetoric into the religious domain, because jihad is a specifically religious term about striving in the way of God. So we've talked about this creation of an Islamic polity that will remove all non-Islamic polities, and he's saying, oh, and by the way, this is a religious requirement. This comes from a divine base. You can turn the lights back off. He also founded Jama'at al-Islami, which is the largest Islamic political party in South Asia. It has branches in Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh. And in Pakistan, it's been part of the government off and on. Now, what do Islamists think of Jews? I'm sure you're scratching your head about this, but it helps to go to the past a little bit. So this is actually Muhammad's interaction with Jews. Now there were some positive interactions and stories, but what really captivates the Islamists are the negative stories, which are far more potent. This picture on the left is a picture of an Arab soldier, Arab Muslim soldier, riding in the Battle of Uhud. Now, you'd be forgiven for thinking that this is ISIS propaganda because the flag looks exactly like the ISIS flag today. But this is actually from a Shiite website. So they would be loath to give Islamic State any credit because Islamic State is Sunni, and Islamic State has targeted Shiites for death and assassination on numerous occasions. It's simply that Islamic State is using the historical flag of Muhammad's days to show that they are continuing the battle tradition from this history and giving it religious value and sanctity. The picture in the middle is the beheading of Banu Qurayza. There were several Jewish tribes over which Muhammad had power in the 620s CE, and one of them was Banu Qurayza. During one of the numerous battles that Muhammad was fighting, they were alleged to have been traitorous. And so he killed all of the men, all 600 of them, over the age of 12. And you can see this is the beheading. These are the men, and this is the shallow grave. After that moment, the last Jewish tribe in Medina fled to the nearby city of Khaybar, which is what this remnant is today in Saudi Arabia. And Muhammad actually pursued them to Khaybar and killed all of the Jews there in pursuit of their wealth and their women. So Muhammad has a really prolonged interaction with Jews in the Islamic holy literature, because when he moves from Mecca, which is primarily a henotheistic and pagan society, to Medina, which has about half Jewish population, half pagan population, he begins to have a relationship with the Jews, and it starts out relatively well, but it begins to become fractious when Jews refuse to recognize Muhammad as being a divine prophet. And we see various motifs come to the fore about Jews from this Muhammadan period. The first one is disloyalty, right? The Jews didn't assist the Muslims in war, which is what we were connoting with the slaughter of Banu Qurayza. We have the idea of stubbornness, that Jews refused to accept Muhammad's prophecy. They didn't. It's not that Jews didn't accept Muhammad's prophecy because they had legitimate arguments, such as no prophecy coming after Micah, or the idea that Muhammad wasn't actually the sire of King David. It wasn't any of these logical arguments. It was simply that Jews couldn't listen to reality. They couldn't accept their own wrongdoing in not accepting Muhammad. And so Jews will be forever corrupted in this way and not able to be brought into the fold of reasonable thinking people. And then you have the idea of crookedness. This first shows up with the idea that Jews altered their holy scriptures so that way Muhammad wouldn't fit into them. And further went on to the idea that Jews are miserly, and this, of course, would only be exacerbated in modern times with European anti-Semitism, which is, of course, the next slide. And we have this wonderful book. Can anybody read the Arabic? Protocols of the Elders of Zion. And this is one of the Arab editions. There are numerous Arab editions all across the Arab world. And European anti-Semitism begins to permeate the Islamic world in the 19th century and into the 20th century. So you get all these new motifs about Jews that come from Europe that hadn't been independently developed in the Islamic world. The first one is this mass conspiracy. In the Arab world, there was never this idea of a Jewish mass conspiracy, but Europe had this, that Jews were somehow in control of all the governments, and they were making some sort of magical political decisions. Because, of course, in the Arab world, this would never have made any sense. Jews were excluded from politics. Jews were repressed by the Sheikh al-Islam and the Sultan. There's no way that they would be able to control all the politics and all the policies. But in Europe, this was completely possible. So this conspiracy theory made its way to the Arab world. No worse for wear, because it kept being translated into Arabic numerous times. You also have racialism, right? In the Arab world, hatred of Jews was a religious one. You converted to Islam, you were a Muslim. That was it. But now there's this idea of Jews being an ethnicity as well as a religion. The same way that Muslim in the modern period is changing from being just a religion to an ethnicity as well, Jews are becoming an ethnicity, which means that they can't be integrated into Muslim society. Some go as far as to say that they are a different species, citing one or two verses from the Quran that make an equivalence between Jews and apes. Then you have this idea of eternal enemies that comes up. The Jews will forever be antagonistic to Islamic rulers, which fits into this whole idea of them being unchanging. And right, because if we remember back to our Muslim motifs, one of them is that they're stubborn and they can't be integrated. Well, that's why they're going to be our eternal enemies, because they can't be integrated. And finally, the blood libels. This had been something that had not existed in the Arab world in any measured sense. But starting in the 1840s with the first blood libel in Damascus, where Jews were believed to have killed a Christian monk, it starts spreading in the Arab world that Jews kill Muslims and Christians to drink their blood and to use it to make matzah.
When did it start, sorry?
The first major one in the Arab world was in 1840 in Damascus, as far as I'm aware.
But didn't it start like in Europe first?
No. These are all European
Yeah.
motifs that came to the Arab world. I'm just saying that these were things that didn't exist in the Arab world prior to the 19th century in any real sense. And the blood libel is still actually very popular in the Islamic world, even though it's lost its popularity in Europe. So we're going to see a couple patterns, right? You're going to see these negative Jewish motifs based on Islamic narratives. You're going to see the European anti-Semitism mixed in, and you're going to have anti-Zionism being a primary result of that, right? This is the Jews embracing their ethnicity. They're breaking away from Muslims, and therefore we have to stop them, because they will never be able to be reconciled, and they are evil people. And of course, violence against Jews is going to rise when you have this kind of narrative. And the government, in an Islamist state, right, is embracing this religious political conversation. So they will take an active role in fighting Jews and Judaism where they can. And of course, I can't cover everything. I'm sorry. I think you guys want to go home before 10 o'clock. If I don't cover your favorite example of Islamist repression of the Jews, forgive me. Then this is one of the things that I think is very interesting to see. We remember earlier that Hassan al-Banna created the Muslim Brotherhood modeled on fascist themes, and you can see here the Nazi salute actually, right, has been incorporated into almost every Islamist group. This is actually the Lebanese Christian Phalangist group, and they've taken on the same symbols because they actually modeled themselves off of the Nazis as well. It's incredibly popular, and of course this is what? Sorry? Yeah, the Mufti, exactly. Mufti Haj Amin al-Husseini. This particular photo was taken when he went to Bosnia to recruit Bosnian Muslims, the Bosniaks, to create the Hanjar battalions of the SS. They were the first Muslim divisions of the SS and served Germany faithfully during World War II. So, you have an alliance between the Ikhwan, or Muslim Brotherhood, and the Nazis. And it's based on a mutual support. And the mutual support has really two legs to it. The first one that comes up almost immediately is that in the Arab world, right, you're opposing the British and the French. Who's opposing the British and the French? Well, the Nazis are. So there's that natural alliance between the Islamists and the Nazis based on this anti-British French angle. But that's really not the center of their alliance. Their center of alliance is based on their hatred of liberal democracy. They don't believe that values should come from human rights and dignity, but from an overriding cultural narrative. And they both hate Jews immensely. And that worked out really well between them. Hassan al-Banna himself, as I said, created the Ikhwan based on fascist principles. This is in terms of its organization, its cell structure, its militarism, its view of art and society as things that were vain and only useful if in service of the commanding cultural ideology. You have attacks on the Jewish quarter in Cairo. This happens in 1947, 1948, and 1950. In each attack, roughly 40 Jews are killed, and numerous amounts of property were destroyed, all led by the Muslim Brotherhood, because at this point the Muslim Brotherhood is centralized in Egypt. It would eventually spread to other areas. In fact, Hamas is the Palestinian chapter of the Muslim Brotherhood. And of course, Haj Amin al-Husseini, who we mentioned, he developed the Hanjar battalions in Europe, and he did a number of other activities in Europe, such as preventing 10,000 children who would have escaped Europe in a secret deal. He forced them to go back to the concentration camps. But in the Middle East itself, he was also responsible for attacks on Jews, and this is where he actually wielded direct government power. In Iraq, for example, he joined with Rashid al-Kailani and led a coup d'etat in 1941, which led to the Farhud, which is the largest Jewish pogrom in the Arab world, 200 dead, and thousands of wounded, and millions of dollars in today's money in property damage. So, we've covered sort of the early history of Islamism. One of the things I want to take a short detour for is Shiite Islamism, right? Because we've been talking about Sunnis for the majority of this. The Muslim Brotherhood is Sunni. All three men that I gave you, Qutb, Hassan al-Banna, and al-Maududi, are all Sunnis. So where do the Shiites fit into this? How do they understand Islamism? And so you have the Islamic Revolution in Iran, and of course Iran is a majority Shiite country, and so the people who are revolting here are Shiites. You can also see that this is Khomeini. He's also wearing the traditional Shiite cleric outfit. You can remember from earlier, Sayyid Jamaluddin was wearing the same kinds of garments because they're both Shiite clerics, even though Sayyid Jamaluddin really hates Khomeini and thinks that Khomeini ruined Shiite Islam. So what happened in the Islamic Revolution, right? You had a nationalist Shah. He believed in creating a Persian state along Western values, very industrialized. But when they overthrew it, they had to create an idea of how do we justify in Shiite Islam that we will rule over the world? Because this system of Caliph and Shaykh al-Islam had been a Sunni system. It had always been a Sunni system, and the Shiites had really not done well under it. So they had to come up with this idea of the rule of the jurist, wilayat al-faqih, or in Persian, wilayat al-faqih. And in that system, right, the Shiites would be able to assert a religious reason for ruling. And what they said was that the secular government had abandoned Islam and was not teaching it properly, so what we need to do is completely reverse it. And this is a change from Shiite state apathy, because when the Sunnis were in power, they were repressing Shiites all the time. There was really no way for a Shiite to be involved in the state, so there was really no desire to improve the state or to run it. And the Islamists in the revolution, they seize on the fragmentation between the different non-Islamist parties. For example, they allied with the communists. The communists believed that they could use the Islamists to their advantage. It turned out the Islamists used the communists to their advantage and were able to write an Islamist constitution and then throw the communists in jail. Now, one of the major problems is that the West actually preferred Islamism to take power in Iran. In the late 1970s, the major enemy of the United States was, of course, the communists. And anybody who wasn't communist was better than communist. So the Western countries decided that when it looked more and more clear that the Islamists would take power in Iran, that they would prefer that. And this took place in the Guadalupe Conference. And the way they framed it was the green line against the red menace, green representing Islam, because green is typically the color associated with Islam, and red representing communism. And they figured that there would be a ring of green countries in the Middle East that would prevent communists from taking over. They got a little bit more than they were bargaining for, I guess. So, now the Ayatollah has a very interesting position on Jews that's not reflected by most Islamists. And we're going to discuss that a little bit. I just wanted to put up on the left, you have the leaders of Iran's Jewish community, all 8,600 of them that are left. The majority of Persian Jews are either in the United States or in Israel. You have Ahmadinejad hosting his Holocaust denial conference back in 2006. And the attendees on the right of him are emissaries of Neturei Karta, who argued that they don't believe that the Holocaust is fake, but that they do believe that Iran's correct that the Holocaust has been used to support Israel, and that they disagree with. But the majority of the conference was actually about Holocaust denial and that it never happened, which is why people like Ernst Zundel went there as well. So you have this unique position of Judaism versus Zionism that the Ayatollah elucidates. It's more clearly written out on your papers if you want to look, but basically he believes that Zionism is an irreligious movement, that it's just a political movement of people who pretend to be Jews but aren't really Jews, and that Israel is a creation that has nothing to do with Judaism and everything to do with political power. So of course he doesn't hate Jews, he just hates Zionism. Which makes it very difficult to figure out exactly where the border is between Judaism and Zionism, which is why there's ideological censorship in Iran to edit out all of the Zionism from what would ostensibly be Judaism. The first thing is that Jews in Iran are put under direct surveillance. The government maintains something just lower than a secret police, and has authorized every Jewish school, has required every Jewish school that opens to have a Shiite Muslim principal who can oversee the curriculum to make sure that there's no pesky Zionism creeping into the Jewish schools. You also have clear Holocaust denial. Ahmadinejad made several statements that he believes that the Holocaust is exaggerated, and when he says exaggerated, he means on orders of magnitude. So we're talking about, he thinks maybe 100,000 people died, maybe 200,000 people died. There's clearly no way that the number 3 million that the Jews manufactured is true. Of course, the number is 6 million. And another Shiite group, which is interesting for us to talk about, are the Zaydis. The Zaydis are the Shiites that live in Yemen. They live in some other places, but Yemen is their largest concentration. And they are being mobilized now in the rebel group called the Houthis. And this is an ongoing civil war in Yemen that's happening right now. On the left we have the slogan of the Houthis, and it says, Allah Akbar, God is the greatest, Al-Maut la-Amerika, death to America, Al-Maut la-Israel, death to Israel, Al-Na'na al-Yahud, curse upon the Jews, Al-Nasr lil-Islam, victory to Islam. I don't think you have difficulty in messaging if that's your slogan. And on the right, we actually have Houthi militants using the traditional Yemeni dagger in their protest after successfully winning Sana'a, which is the capital of Yemen. Now, Shiites historically believe, and this is also true in Iran, but not enforced the same way that the Zaydis wish to, that Jews are najis, which means that they're spiritually impure. Those of you who remember your Bible very well, we have a similar concept in Judaism called tameh. If you remember those passages from Leviticus, and if you touch that carcass, you'll be impure until nightfall, and if you touch a vessel that has touched the carcass, you'll be impure until nightfall, that kind of concept. But they believe that Jews are eternally najis, the same way that a carcass is itself eternally najis. So, so contact between Shiites and Jews must be physically limited, because the Shiites could catch the Jewish impurity if they touch them. Now, najis as a concept was waning under the Ottoman rule because the Sunnis don't believe in this concept, especially as applied to Jews. So, when Yemen, the majority Shiite part of Yemen was under Ottoman control, najis was not as relevant of a concept. But as Zaydis are beginning to mobilize in this Islamist jihadist attack, this popular Zaydi belief of najis is coming back to the fore, and it's making it very difficult for the remaining Jews in Yemen to survive. So you have the Houthi rebellion, right, and you have anti-Semitism that goes with it. So the last Jews of Sana'a are desperately trying to leave because it's completely untenable to live in a society where you are physically seen to be impure everywhere you go. You can't exchange things because if you touch something that somebody else touches, then you make them impure. And never mind the actual violence by Houthis against anybody who's not Shiite Muslim. So, we're not going to keep this to the Middle East. Islamism is going to come to our back door. So, we have the expansion into Europe and the States. The first major expansion of Islam to the West was actually done by the Turks in what's called Mini Gurush. And Mini Gurush is a Turkish Islamist movement that was actually banned in Turkey because Turkey was a nationalist state. So they took their campaign to Europe because Europe had freer laws on freedom of expression. And you can see on the left the Oath of Mini Gurush, that they want to establish a new world order, and that the victory is for the believers and the victory is near. In the middle you have Erbakan, who was the Najmuddin Erbakan, who was the founder of Mini Gurush. And on the right, you have a Mini Gurush center in Germany, which is why on the top it says Islamic Gemeinschaft Mini Gurush, right? The Islamic community of Mini Gurush in Germany. And so they started in the 1960s, and right as I was saying, there was democracy in Turkey only beginning after World War II, and when that democracy happened, the Islamists actually were able to do something with regards to the state. And this led to an Islamist cultural groundswell. People began to identify as Islamists and start voting that way, which led to Erbakan forming Mini Gurush. And his prime argument in Mini Gurush is that moral and spiritual strength come through faith in Islam. And because this faith in Islam will lead him to power, that it creates this link and this Islamist movement. Now, Mini Gurush was banned in Turkey. In fact, Erbakan had to form 6 different political parties because each one was successively banned because the Turkish constitution bans Islamist parties. And so as soon as his party was determined to be Islamist, it was banned, and he had to found a new one. But his ideas were able to spread to Europe with the massive labor movement of Turks to Germany and the Netherlands. The next one, of course, is Saudi investment. Notice it's from the same time period, the 1960s. And you have the Saudi clerics on the left. These are the Wahhabi clerics who are still sort of running the Sheikh al-Islam role in Saudi Arabia. And on the right, you have the Al-Ibrahimi Mosque, which was built for Gibraltar's 4,000 large Muslim community. And it cost 5 billion UK pounds to build. Gibraltar is in the UK, so they use pounds. This is one of over 1,500 mosques that the Saudis have built in the West in order to evangelize their version of Islam, which is, coincidentally, more in line with Islamist belief. So Saudi Arabia is Wahhabist. Wahhabist is a doctrine within Sunni Islam, and it's very strict in its interpretation and implementation of Islam on a day-to-day basis. Now, they started investing in order to counter what was going on in the Arab world. Because in the Arab world, you have these Arab socialists, right? Arab socialists are secular, generally. And so the Saudis were very put off by this. How are we going to have a Muslim world if people are becoming more and more secular? And if you've seen any pictures from when Nasser was in power in Egypt, you have women in bikinis, you have cafe stands where boys and girls interact. It looks like a modern Western country. And the Saudis were afraid of this cultural trend, and so they sought to spend money to reverse it, and they have achieved success in that. So it began in 1962. As I said, there are over 1,500 mosques in the West, and they also train the imams who go to these mosques, which means that they're importing their version of Islam on the street in these countries. And so studies have shown in Europe that Muslim youth are actually more conservative than their parents were, even though their parents were not born in Europe, and they were born in Europe. Specifically because of this. The next issue that we have is Islamist vigilantism. Now, these are Islamists who believe that they have the ability to enforce their will on the streets. So on the left, we have Sharia police in Germany. These are individuals who patrol a majority Muslim neighborhood and will arrest people for Sharia infractions. This is a placard from a British Sharia-controlled zone are the things that you can't do in a Sharia-controlled zone, such as drinking alcohol, gambling, injecting yourself with needles, or wearing high-heeled shoes, because we all know that those are equal levels of offense. And on the right, we have a situation in Bangladesh where an atheist was macheted to death in the street for criticizing Islam. Of course, Bangladesh is a majority Muslim country in South Asia, but it fits into the general theme of Islamist vigilantism. So you have the situation where the government itself is not Islamist at this point, right? You've got European states, you've got Bangladesh, which is a purely secular state, but the families and the communities themselves will come together and enforce the law by their own means. And so you'll start seeing Western Muslims skirting bans on Islamic practices that are actually banned in the West, right? So, for example, female genital mutilation is banned in the West. It's an Islamic cultural practice. We can debate whether or not it comes from the religion per se, but what a lot of Pakistani Muslims in Britain, for example, will do is they'll send their daughter to Pakistan to have the surgery done, and then bring the girl back after it's been taken care of, so that way they don't run into problems with the UK authorities. You also have these Sharia patrolled neighborhoods, like we were discussing before. They're increasing in number and increasing in size.
Do they have their own jails and everything?
They don't have their own jails yet, but they generally will inflict something closer to corporal punishment, or they'll just throw the person out. So
how did the actual governments let them get away with this?
we'll actually get to that. And of course, we're beginning to see honor killings in Western countries. Honor killings happen when it's believed that somebody in the community, usually a young girl, but it can also be a guy, is flouting Islamic doctrine, and so the family has lost its honor in the community because the child is becoming too secular, and so they'll, in order to recover their honor, they will kill the offending person. Finally, you have the killing of atheists and dissenters in the Islamic world, which is what we see in Bangladesh. There was a list, for example, made of 82 Bangladeshi bloggers about 3 years ago by a number of Islamist groups. Already 10 of them have been killed, and probably more of them will be killed soon. Finally, this goes to your question. The police and the justice systems in Western countries and Islamic countries typically ignore the problem. They either pretend it doesn't happen, or they say that it's Islamophobic to do anything about it, that they're not treating Muslims as equal citizens if they enforce the same laws on them as they enforce on everybody else, which is an incredible piece of doublethink. So how does this affect us, right? I mean, other than sort of the general. These sort of highlight 3 different situations going on in Europe as concerns the Jews specifically. On the left, we have Ilan Hanimi. I don't know how familiar you are with the situation in France, but Ilan was a French-born Jew, and he was kidnapped by a gang of Muslims, primarily from Africa. He was tortured, and when he was finally recovered, he was too hurt by his injuries to make a recovery, and so he died. And so there was a major inquiry. Of course, the offenders were held to account, but this kind of phenomenon of Muslims who want to take the law into their own hands, attacking Jews, primarily on the argument that Jews are representatives of Israel in some way, and therefore they're getting their way back at the state. And that actually goes into the middle picture. This is actually a synagogue in Wuppertal in Germany, and this was a synagogue where it was graffitied first, Free Palestine, and then the synagogue was firebombed. Thankfully, nobody was in the synagogue at the time, so nobody was injured. But what's really striking about this is not the attack on the synagogue. Synagogue attacks are fairly common now in Europe, 1 or 2 or 3 per year. But what's interesting about this is that it went to the courts, and the courts actually ruled that this was a legitimate form of protest against Israel, because this was 2014 and there was the Gaza war, and so firebombing a Jewish synagogue was a legitimate act of protest against the Israeli occupation of Palestine, never mind the fact that the Jews who went to that synagogue were Germans and had absolutely nothing to do with Israeli policy. Then on the right, we
that verdict was given in a German court?
Yes, this was a ruling made in a lower German court now the people who firebombed the synagogue were still found guilty of a crime, that they firebombed the synagogue, but they weren't found guilty of a hate crime against Jews. And the hate crime against Jews part was because this was clearly a protest against Israel, even though they're firebombing a synagogue, because synagogues are representatives of Israel. That was the argument made by the.
Did it hold?
There was no appeal.
There was no appeal by the Jews or to a higher court or anything?
No. Then on the right-hand side, we have the situation in Malmö. Malmö is a city in southern Sweden, and that's probably the worst place for Jews in Europe at the moment. This particular picture was that during the Gaza war, there was a protest by the Jews in Malmö about, stand with Israel, defending Israel. There was a counter-protest that swelled up from the Muslim residents of Malmö, who are now close to just about the majority of the city, around 50%. And the counter-protest became so violent. They were throwing rocks at the Jews, they were throwing glass at the Jews and other Israel supporters, that the Swedish actually decided that it would be a smarter play to stop the Jews from protesting than to try and corral the counter-protesters. And the mayor of the town, her name was Ritalu, said that the Jews shouldn't have anything to fear if they just denounce Israel. Like it would, then they could be perfectly good Swedish citizens, and there would be no problem. Her negligence in this regard went on for a while until the U.S. read her the Riot Act. But without that kind of foreign intervention, the situation in Sweden would likely have deteriorated further, and it still continues to deteriorate for Jews there. Mm-hmm. So, what's going on? So we've got the Saudi money, right? And we've got the migration, and we've got the spread of Islamist doctrine to cause Islamism to become a more viable presence in Europe. At the same time, we see targeting of synagogues and, quote, clearly Jewish individuals for violence. What I mean by that is you're more likely to be attacked if you wear a kippah, you're more likely to be attacked if you have Jewish paraphernalia, because you're a more easy target to see, and you're more representative of what they believe the Jews are. For example, in Malmö, people in traditional garb have reported many more instances of violence than people who just dress like normal Swedes, even if the normal dressing Swedes are more, quote, Zionist in their outlook. And the real problem here is that European leaders end up excusing anti-Semitism as legitimate forms of anti-Zionism, and they don't want to talk about Islamism as a concept. They don't want to offend Muslims, and they can't see, right, because Islamists have spent a long time crafting this idea that Islam and Islamism are the same. They don't want to criticize Islamism because then they feel that their populations who are Muslim will not respect them for it. And this is key. Muslims see the Jews in Europe as representing the Israeli government. This is something that is somehow unique to Jews, because, for example, if I attacked a Chinese person and said that I'm doing this because I really hate the repression of the Chinese government, people would just look at you like you're a crazy person. What does this average Chinese person have anything to do with the Chinese government or its will? But somehow, if you're a Jew in Europe, you are a representative of the Israeli government and its actions. And this is a view particularly prevalent in the Muslim community, but also prevalent to a high degree in the European, European ex-Christian or Christian community. So it allows for this meme to keep going, and that's why you had the event such as the synagogue in Wuppertal, where the justice literally said that it was a legitimate anti-Israel protest to firebomb a synagogue. So, and you thought that it hasn't crossed the Atlantic. So, we have Islamism in America. These are 4 Islamists who have done various things in America. On the left we have Siraj Wahhaj. He was vice president of the Islamic Society of North America. He was also the first Muslim to give an invocation to the President of the United States. Previously Muslims weren't giving invocations, it was just Christians and Jews. But as the United States has become more religiously diverse, they've allowed Muslims to do it too, which is completely understandable. But what's not understandable is why he would be chosen, because he in particular has said that Allah's deen of Islam will take over the United States, and it will be a replacement for the Constitution. His exact quote is a little bit different than that, but he has said it numerous times that he prefers the Shari'a to the Constitution, and he would like to see it one replaced for the other. The next one, Ghassan al-Ashi was a Palestinian, and he was one of the major individuals found guilty in the Holy Land Foundation trial in 2006. It was the largest Hamas funding trial that has ever happened, and he was a coordinator between making sure that the payments to the Holy Land Foundation made their way to Hamas. He's currently in jail, but he did an incredible amount of damage in that way. You have Ibrahim Hooper, who's the director of CARE, Council on American Islamic Relations, and his primary objective is to prevent the police from actively enforcing anti-Islamism. So he wants police officers to undergo sensitivity training that will try and make anti-Islamist actions anti-Muslim actions. He's also, prior to 9/11, there was a poster that had come after the bombings of the US embassies in Africa, in Nairobi and in Dar es Salaam, and where bin Laden had said, "I am the enemy of the United States." There's a poster that just repeated bin Laden's line with his picture, and he sued to have it taken down because, of course, this is offensive to all Muslims that bin Laden is an asshole. And finally, on the right, we have Mohammed El-Biari. He was a vice deputy in the Homeland Security Advisory Commission, and he served there from 2010 to 2014, when he was summarily dismissed for possibly leaking secrets from the Homeland Security Commission to reporters. Among his tweets while he was in office included wonderful things like, the United States is a Shari'a Islamically compliant country, there is nothing to fear from the Muslim Brotherhood, and there's nothing to fear from the Muslim Brotherhood, and that he saw no issue between Islamism and the United States government. So the thing is that we have a high-level presence of Islamist groups in the United States, right? You've got groups like CARE, Council of American Islamic Relations, Islamic Council of North America, ICNA, Islamic Society of North America, ISNA. These organizations have a primarily Islamist agenda, and their identity as Muslims is based on this Muslim ethnic character that we discussed as being a creation of Hassan al-Banna and other early Islamists. Now, one of the things is that the Islamists are seen to represent the Muslim community, right? If there's some Muslim event, right, who do they turn to? Oh, here's the representative at CARE who's going to speak about how the Muslims feel about insert event. or some terrorist thing goes on. Where's the resident Muslim I can find? They'll go to these organizations, which means that their voice becomes the voice of the Islamic community rather than the voices of individual Muslims and their particular political views. Islamists in the United States have the primary goal of undermining democracy. And they treat any criticism of their politics as simply Islamophobia, be it on freedom of speech or freedom of the press. They also, try to elide the concept of anti-Islamism and anti-Muslim bigotry. So if you, for example, burn a Quran, that means that you hate Muslims, not that you hate the ideas of the Quran. Now, I don't advocate Quran burning, but those two things are ideologically different. And one of the Islamists in the United States' goals is to elide that difference, so that way people will be afraid to criticize the one, even at the risk of the other. And finally, they push for sensitivity training, which means that a lot of terms that would be incredibly helpful for U.S. government forces to understand about the history of jihad, the development of jihadism, the development of Islamism, these sort of ideological concepts are cut out of the counterterrorism manual because it might hurt the feelings of Muslims who may chance upon them. Whether or not that's actually true, that they would be hurt by those documents. And finally, what does it look like when jihadism is successful? We have some jihadist states to look at. Of course, the first jihadist states are Hamas and Hezbollah. And on the left, we see a Hamas group, and on the right, we see a Hezbollah army rally in Beirut. Now, what's interesting here is, these organizations, Hezbollah and Hamas, actually came into existence to oppose the state. Hamas was opposing Israel and the Palestinian Liberation Organization, seeing them as illegitimate, and Hezbollah was opposing the Lebanese Christian government. Now, they ended up becoming states after opposing the states because they won territory. Hamas forced Fatah out of Gaza in 2007, and Hezbollah controls the Bekaa Valley and numerous other places in Lebanon since 2006. And so they actually now have constituencies, and they actually have to govern. So one of the things is that politicians have, and thought leaders in this area have thought that they would have to moderate their positions. They haven't. What they've done to enlist local support is to actually function as local welfare systems. They provide education, they provide health care, they do the police. They take care of the people under them. And so that's how they get support, not by changing their policies and becoming more moderate. Which is why Hamas still has curfews in the Gaza Strip and bans music and dancing, because that's important. And you also have, there's a lot of stuff in Islamic jurisprudence about whether or not music is acceptable if that music is not about Islamic themes. So they ban music for that reason. And finally, because Hamas and Hezbollah have done it, that they've created this sort of functional architecture of converting from a jihadist organization to a state, it created the precedent of moving from one to the other. Now, when we come to the Jew hatred with Hamas and Hezbollah, one of the things that's interesting to note is that Hamas doesn't have any Christians to rule over, so it's sort of a moot point. But Hezbollah actually fosters positive relations with the Christian community. They reach out, they try and allow them to run their own affairs, similar to the Ottoman system, where the Shaykh al-Islam did not interfere with the matters of non-Muslims and allowed those leaders to take care of it. Hezbollah will do the same. And so Christian communities in Lebanon who are under Hezbollah authority generally like them and respect them. But, of course, the Jews are completely different. Hezbollah and Hamas will make specific references to Muhammad's issues with the Jews. We remember his fight with the Jews in Medina, that he believed that they were traitors to him, all these motifs about them being stubborn and they're being crooked. Palestinian protests will often focus on the idea of Khaybar, right? The Jews fled to Khaybar, just like the Jews fled from the Arab world to Israel. And so the Muslims will return to Khaybar and slaughter the Jews now as Muhammad did then. So you'll have the common refrain at a number of Palestinian protests. Khaybar Khaybar ya Yahud, Jish Muhammad Sayyahud. Khaybar Khaybar, O Jews, the army of Muhammad is coming. And this was also the refrain sung on the Mavi Marmara, which was the Turkish flotilla that in 2010 that Israel boarded and stopped from arriving in Gaza with officially health and human services supplies, unofficially weapons. And there are references in the charters both of Hamas and Hezbollah that refer to the Jews in a negative sense. And most commonly is the hadith of the tree of Qarqad, which is a hadith about the end of days. And it says that in the end of days, the Muslims will be forced to kill the Jews, and they'll be looking for Jews, and Jews will hide under rocks. The trees will tell the Muslims, oh, there's a Jew behind me, come kill him, except for the tree of Qarqad, which is a Jewish tree, and somehow allies itself with the Jews. So they take time out of their constitution to just make a note that this is an important part of their governance structure. And of course, probably what you guys were all looking forward to is Islamic State. Islamic State, of course, is the most powerful jihadist group in the world today, commands the most attention. On the left, we have Islamic State's map of the world. This is their current territorial ambition. They don't control most of that currently, but that's how they'd like to run it. If you notice, the names of the provinces that they're using are the same names as those provinces were named when the Muslims first conquered them. So it's a very revanchist organization in that way. In the middle, we have Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, who is the current caliph of the Islamic State. If you remember, the last caliph we had was Abdul-Majid II, who was dethroned in 1924. There hasn't been a caliph since then, until this man has summarily declared himself the caliph. So he's trying to return to that historical structure of the caliph ruling. And on the right, we have militants of Islamic State as they advance in Syria. This is it's a picture from 2 years ago. So, right, the first thing that they wanted to do is they wanted to create a caliphate, right? Their goal was to govern. They used the Hamas and Hezbollah model to then create a governance structure. And so, as I said, Ataturk removed the caliph, created a more decentralized Islam, divorced Islam from politics, and so they're trying to undo Ataturk's success in that regard by reinstating a theocratic government headed by a caliph. One of the things that Islamic State is known for is their massive iconoclasm. There are some Islamist groups and jihadist groups that are iconoclastic, like the Taliban and Islamic State. And so Islamic State will go around destroying sites that it believes are sacrilege to God. So it's destroyed places like the Roman ruins at Palmyra. It's destroyed ancient Assyrian ruins. And of course, they've also destroyed Jewish historic relics, like the Tomb of Jonah. When they wanted to destroy the Tomb of Ezra, they didn't get close enough to it. But they destroy these relics because they believe that they divert worship from God, and because people are worshiping the relic as opposed to God. And with the Roman ruins, it's because they represent a pre-Islamic period. It goes back to this Jahiliyyah, that age of ignorance that Sayyid Qutb was mentioning. And of course, what makes Islamic State really unique is internet-led self-radicalization, which is a new phenomenon where they will disseminate materials over the internet, use social media effectively to target Muslims who may be more amenable to their views, and then proceed to give them the propaganda so that they can undergo the process of radicalization without ever having to meet face-to-face with members of Islamic State. And that leads to all these, quote, lone wolf events that have been taking place in the United States, such as San Bernardino, and the shooting in the nightclub in Miami, because the self-radicalization technique is much more effective for targeting the West than a direct assault. So, I just want to throw up the percentages again, if there are any questions, yeah. So, yeah, any questions? Yeah.
great talk, Richard. Amazing,
Thank you.
voluminous. But in terms of, you're saying this has been about a 50-year, from the 70s till now. What percentage of the 1 point whatever billion
Sure.
Muslims would consider themselves Islamists?
Okay, right, you sort of have degrees here. If we're talking about people who, if an Islamist government were to come to power, they would support that. You're talking about just under the majority of the population. However, the majority of people aren't interested in making that happen. So we cut into that a little bit further. You have about 20% of the Muslim population, depends on the 15 to 20%, depends on the country, because we can look at Islamist voting patterns in different countries. You have between 15 and 20% of the people who would actually vote for an Islamist to go into power. The actual number of people who would be jihadists, right, the ones who want to do it through violence, is less than 1%, right? But still, less than 1% of 1.6 billion is a lot of people. There are currently, depending on whose estimates you trust, roughly 300,000 jihadists in the world. And they can cause a lot of mayhem, especially in places where government is not effective in thwarting. A perfect example was, we were talking about Abdul Munim al-Futuh. He was running in the Egyptian election. In the first round of the Egyptian election, he was an Islamist and Morsi was an Islamist. The other three candidates were not Islamists. The other three candidates together got just over 55% of the vote. Morsi got 25% of the vote, and Munim al-Futuh got 17% of the vote.
But can you believe those numbers?
The voting records from Egypt?
Yes. Yeah.
I mean, by UN estimates, the election in 2012 was free and fair. It's the only free and fair election Egypt has ever had. But I think that those numbers, that election represents Egypt's position on Islamism much more so than the final election that put Morsi in power, because then it was a question between voting between basically Ahmed al-Shafiq, who was the other candidate who ran in the final election, was one of Mubarak's proteges. So it was literally between voting for the old regime or voting for anything else, as opposed to the people who, in the first election, had choices like Omar Musa and other candidates who could be less well connected to the Mubarak regime, and so, and including a Nasserist. So you had other ways that people could have voted, and so that election more reflects where the Egyptian population is. The Egyptian population is also a little bit more conservative than the average, right? Because you have to balance it with places like Lebanon or Morocco, which are more left-wing, more modernized.
What was the philosophy behind removing Hosni Mubarak out of Egypt and
By
the
who?
leader in Libya, Muammar al-Gaddafi? What was the philosophy behind
But
it?
philosophy from who?
From the Western
From
countries?
the Western countries?
Kind of
The-
orchestrated
Sure.
all these.
The Western countries believed that these were endemic democratic movements that were similar to the democratic movements of Eastern Europe in the late 1980s, and similar to the democratic movements in South America in the mid-1990s. So they thought that it was the next wave of democracy, that it was coming to the Arab world, and they saw no reason to stand in the way of increased democratization. They did not, and also in the protest period of the Arab Spring, Islamists were not the majority. The majority were liberals who were disaffected with Mubarak. Now, the difference is that the Islamists had better networks. So because voting was expedited in the Egyptian election, the Islamists were able to mobilize those networks. These are Muslim Brotherhood networks that had been set up over 50 years ago. And they were able to turn out the vote much more effectively than the newer candidates who were more liberal, but didn't have that kind of entrenched dissemination of influence. In Libya, I think it was primarily humanitarian, because at that point it became increasingly clear that Libya was not going to become a democracy after Gaddafi was removed, but it was seen that he was butchering his own people with mercenaries, and so the Libyan transitional government, which wasn't really existing at that point, but it had some members. They went to the United Nations and they asked for UN intervention on humanitarian grounds, and that was what led Britain and France to lead the mission in Libya, and Obama to, quote, lead from behind, which is how the Libya invasion worked.
Hosni Mubarak has been keeping the Muslim Brotherhood quite well under control in Egypt.
Correct.
Throughout his
Correct.
ruling.
Sure.
For more than 20 years.
Sure, but the thing is that if you have an organization that's being repressed, it's still an organization, as opposed to, for example, the Nasrists, who really didn't have any organizational links, Amr Musa, who was sort of a lone man candidate, and Ahmed Shafiq, his only pull was that he was connected to the people who really liked the regime, but he had no networks. He had no connections to anybody aside from the elite and the Christians, because the Christians preferred to maintain the status quo, and the elites also, but there was no way of reaching out the message.
Well, so when you said that the majority of, or you said like the Saudis had built 1,500 mosques in Europe and the West.
Sure.
Are the majority of mosques and the majority of Islam teachings coming from Saudi Arabia, or is it now become a wider?
When Saudi Arabia builds a mosque, one of the conditions that they impose when they build the mosque is that they will send the imam to head it. So the mosque effectively becomes a loudspeaker for Saudi thought. Now, is there an increasing diversity of imams? Yes, there's an imam, for example, in Washington, D.C. who's openly gay and has an openly gay congregation. Now, he's literally the one in the 1.6 billion. So, there is an increasing diversity. One of the major issues in terms of creating a diversity in Islamic thought is that almost all of the major seminaries are either in Egypt, in Saudi Arabia, or in Iran. Right? If you want to become a Sunni cleric, you need to graduate from Al-Azhar or from the academies in Mecca. If you want to become a Shia cleric, you have to graduate from Qom. There's really no other way to get it. If Sunni and Shia academies start being built in the West, which is something that people are starting to play around with. Hamza Yusuf, for example, is a Muslim sheikh in the United States, conservative, but not Islamist. He's trying to create a seminary in California for the teaching of Islamic scholars. Whether or not that will have the seal of approval is something else.
I guess my question was more focused around where is the jihadi sentiment coming from? Is it really going to be primarily through these social media networks and that sort of, and the newer technologies, or is it also going to be in the mosques, in which case it's coming from a Saudi Arabian background?
Yeah, you have both. You have some people who go to relatively conservative mosques, not Islamist mosques, but conservative mosques, and these people, and in those cases, right, you have the younger individuals who are looking on the internet and finding that quote, their imam is not conservative enough, and they feel that what's coming over the internet and from Saudi Arabia makes more sense. And then you have people who are radicalized inside the mosque. You have both scenarios. But what makes Islamic State unique is that their primary recruiting technique is the self-radicalization. They don't send out people with flyers the way that, for example, the Muslim Brotherhood used to.
Oh, I just have one question. If you could quickly touch upon the welfare aspect that the different groups you talked about, whether they be the Ikhwan or
Sure.
Wahhabis, like how that helped mobilize support for what Dr. Yaakov was saying, as far as, having that 50 years of legwork ahead of you to build the network to then get lots of people out in droves to vote, and why people are so loyal to these different groups.
Right, but this is sort of apples to oranges, right? Because the networks that developed healthcare and the government services were those who actually had political power. In the case of the Ikhwan in Egypt, they didn't have political power.
Right.
So they didn't develop those networks. The networks that they developed were meetings in the mosques. One of the things that typically happened in the repressive societies in the Middle East is that every network was clamped down on, but the mosques had some liberty to discuss matters more freely within their walls. And so they became a place where people would be dissenting, and that really helped Islamism because the mosque is their home territory for those mosques that are more Islamist.
Well, what about basics like zakat and like literally food and education that were
Sure.
provided through
No, but I mean, we're talking in that case talking about Hamas and Hezbollah when they finally had power, and then the first thing that they did is they started developing these bureaucratic bodies. They have Hamas has divisions within it of people who are not militants. they are bureaucrats, and they go and they teach in schools. Of course, the curriculum that they're teaching in the school is that, you know, all Jews are apes and pigs, and but the health, and they're going to give health care. So, you know, your son breaks his knee, he'll go to a Hamas-run hospital, and all of these aspects. Now, Hezbollah has much more money, just generally speaking. So their healthcare and their education is much more advanced than what Hamas has, but it's the same sort of thing. And so the local citizens say the Lebanese government, for example in Hezbollah, the Lebanese government never really took care of me and my community, but now Hezbollah is here, and they're providing us welfare for my husband who can't work because he's injured, and they're teaching my kids in school, and my life is getting better. Why wouldn't I support Hezbollah? Like this is a decision in my interest. Yeah.
You mentioned that the Western nation after Guadalupe conference,
Right.
they started to promote the Green Movement.
They were willing to accept it.
They were willing to accept it, but isn't it true that the United States actually pushed Saudi Arabia to spread Wahhabism right immediately after World War II, and they started building the schools in Pakistan, the madrasas, because they thought it was a protection from communism?
Yes. I don't know how close to World War II it was. I remember there was the conference during World War II between the King of Saudi Arabia at the time and Franklin Delano Roosevelt about the extrication of Saudi oil, and that he would allow Western firms to extricate oil from Saudi Arabia as long as they didn't touch the religion within the country. I think the mobilization of it as an anti-communist measure really came, if you're talking about Pakistan, when India became more part of the Soviet sphere, which was in the mid-60s. And the United States began to support Pakistan almost unilaterally. So I think it really took shape in that time. The biggest, of course, U.S. support for the Islamist movement was the war against the Soviets in Afghanistan, where we actively armed the Mujahideen, the jihadist soldiers in Afghanistan, who were the only serious opposition to the communist satellite state, the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan. Yeah, that was.
Would you say?
Yeah, it was through Saudi Arabia.
Would you say some words about the current migration that happens in Europe in the last years? Like, how is it organized? What's to be expected? How much more will it be? Where will it stop? Will it ever stop?
Okay, sure. But what do you mean by how is it organized? Like, do you mean like, is there a top-down organization for how these people are moving, or?
Well, do you think it's spontaneous?
No, I think it's based on several factors. I think the first factor is that you had migrants who were actually leaving Syria, and so you had the humanitarian reaction of Europe, which was, we'll take you in, and we're going to simplify our asylum process significantly, so there's really no checks on your entry. And when Europe basically offered the welcome mat, a lot of other Muslims in other countries saw that as a good opportunity to come to Europe, because you can have an easier life in Europe than you can in a lot of Islamic countries. A perfect example that's of a really bad situation is Eritrea, right? Eritrea is a country in Africa, Sudan and Ethiopia on the west, the Red Sea on the east. It's literally half and half Muslim-Christian, but there's a mandatory draft for every boy over the age of 13. And it's a country where there's a significant amount of violence, so a lot of people fled, 400,000 to date, Eritrea, making their way to Europe, because Europe has laid out this welcome mat. Now, there's no war going on in Eritrea. There's no direct humanitarian threat for which people actually have to leave. But because Europe opened it up, a lot of these people are coming. According to the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, only 30% of the, quote, Syrian refugees in Europe are actually Syrians. And the remaining 70% are people from elsewhere who are coming either because of situations similar to what I described to you in Eritrea, where it's a bad situation where people want to leave but there's no refugee-ness to it, or they're just economic migrants. There was, for example, in Denmark a few months ago, they changed the law, and it said that only Danish citizens could get asylum benefits. Sorry, the benefits that come with asylum, like a rent check from the government, all these welfare programs, and immigration to Denmark cut in half, because you have a significant number of people who only are coming, or primarily coming, for those economic benefits. So to the extent, so to your first question, is it organized? It's not organized. In fact, it's the exact opposite of organized. It's a lot of individual people making individual decisions, seeing that there are so many people going anyway, that they can join in the rat race. Now, this isn't to say that this is actually new, right? People have been trying to escape into Europe for the last several decades. In fact, Italy had a treaty with Libya back in the 1990s, specifically on this question. And according to the treaty, Libya would be able to invest in Italian companies, and in exchange, Libyan gunboats would shoot down any boat that fled Libya for Italy. And they did. And that held throughout the entirety of Gaddafi's reign. And as soon as Gaddafi was removed, immigration from Libya to Italy went 10 times within the next year. So it's a number of different political factors that have led to this mass migration crisis. It's the horrible situation of life in the Islamic world, the better situation of life in Europe, the changing of the refugee policies in Europe, the mass exodus from Syria as a result of the Syrian civil war, and European leaders being unable to balance their affinity for helping refugees and people in need with the need to actually defend the societies that they're from, and that there's actually a carrying capacity that you have to accept if you're wanting refugees.
How about the 1,500 schools that Fathallah Gulen opened up all over the world, and inviting all the school teachers from Turkey to come? Would you call that Islamism? Or, even though he's more moderate.
No, the difference between Gulenism is that Gulenism doesn't have a position on the government. Gulenism is about societal change. So it's about people acting differently towards each other. It's not about imposed rules from top down, which is why I didn't address it. And I talked about Mini Gurush, which is actually about creating an Islamic government. For those who are a little bit less familiar with Turkish politics, you sort of have three major avenues of Islamic modern thought in Turkey, aside from the seculars who just want to crush it. You have the Erbakanists, right, Mini Gurush, and this group who really want to create an Islam-based society. Then you have the Erdoganists, like the AKP, and their goal is to create a society that's ruled through Islamist means, but is primarily socially Islamist. But they want government power, and the Gulenists are simply social. They don't want the government power, and they want society to change by individual human-to-human interactions. So, while it is evangelism of a sort, it's not Islam.
Would that be a beginning that could change?
I don't think so. I mean, I think after Gulen dies, something could change about it. I don't think Gulen himself is interested in political power, so I don't think he's going to change the movement to that end.
But yet they have Erdogan come to power initially.
They were friendly. Of course, he's going to vote for an Islamist option. But the difference is, what is the movement that he's trying to spawn? And the movement that he's trying to spawn is not one that actually challenges governmental authority. That's the difference.
Thank you.
Great job.
Thank you very much. Wonderful. Hope you all enjoyed it. You have your Sephardi reports. And I also want to remind you that if you or someone you know has stories to tell us about life in Iraq, life in Iraq, if you have books that you would like to donate to us, please see us afterward. I'd like to point out Ezra. Can you stand up? Ezra Ashkenazi, so a researcher there. So either let him know or let me know. And if anybody does want to see Chaibar or any of some of the other Jewish sites, the Tomb of Yonah that was destroyed, we're happy to fly you to them virtually and show you our documentation on them anytime. Thank you.
About his parents. One that they want me to watch. Thank you.
How are you? Hi, how are you? Oh, great. Thanks for coming.
Just a few.
Yeah, a lot.
You did a great job.
You can tell them. That's very impressive. You have a lot of
Welcome.
He was getting warmed up.
Yeah.
He was about to be
Exactly. He was getting warmed up.
Oh.
I wish they videotaped. I would have.
I think they did.
Goodies on it.
Great job, Ray.
But you were getting ahead of him.
He was working towards it. I hear that.
Can we get a copy of that or not?